Chag Sameach. I like to tidy this up a little bit. Okay. I hope you all had lovely Sedarim. So this morning I want to look a little bit back and a little bit forward. So back at one of our Seder customs, at the custom we have to recline as a symbol, as an acting out of our freedom. And to look forward, to find new meaning. And part of the way we look forward, of course, is we look back. So we look at the origins, at the evolution of this practice, and do some complicating, do some reconsidering. So first, some review. We had, 8 cups of wine ago. We began this process. So a little bit of review. One of the 4 questions, the fourth of the 4 questions, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. So there are 4. Does anyone remember the fourth one? I already gave you a spoiler. So matzah, maror, dipping twice, and then the 4th one? Reclining, right. Shebechol haleilot, anu ochlin ben yoshvin uvein mesubin. So on all of the other nights, we eat. Sometimes we recline. Sometimes we just sit in the regular way. Halayla hazeh kulanu mesubin. Everyone on this night reclines. And so that doesn't sound like a question at first, but it's an implied question. Why do we do that? So let's look at some of the sources for why we do that. We learn in Mishnah Psachim, which is part of the our most ancient rabbinic legal code from around the 2nd century, that even the poor of Israel should not eat without reclining, meaning everyone should recline for the Seder. And Rashi explains that all should eat in the way of 3 people, in reclining on a bed and at a table, and that this is how we commemorate the freedom. So it was the way of free people. It has to do with the cultural context of the time. So we know that in the ancient world, fancy, wealthy people ate their meals while reclining. Some of us recline still today, like eating in front of the television. But this was, in the ancient world, this was only for the wealthy, leaning to the left. And then there were tables laid out by servants, which had the food and the drink. And so this was the practice for the wealthy. The slaves didn't eat this way. Slaves couldn't eat this way because it required someone else to set up and to serve. So on Passover, we know that we make a point to recline, and even in an exaggerated way, to lean, to signify that we are no longer slaves. This explanation makes a lot of sense, but of course, Jewish customs are always evolving. We are, as ever, a questioning people. So here are a few sources that I found. There's a fantastic Haggadah called My People's Passover Haggadah, which complicate this explanation that we're going back to ancient times and that's how they did it. And so we're reenacting that custom. So in the medieval period, reclining was already no longer the custom. It no longer had that same cultural meaning that it had in the ancient world. So already we see in the medieval period that reclining at the Seder was beginning to feel anachronistic. So we think that we question and we, look at some of our customs and we think they're out of date or old-fashioned. Well, we've always been doing that. So even the rabbis in the medieval period were doing that. One from 13th century France, the Rabbi, held that the practice of reclining at the Seder was no longer obligatory at all. And instead, one should sit in one's customary position at the Seder. So that doesn't apply to us anymore. This is in the 13th century, so we shouldn't do it. Another rabbi, the Maharil from the 15th century in Germany, went even farther than, do what you want or, be comfortable. And he said, not only is it not obligatory, but it's prohibited. So he prohibited full reclining at the Seder, exclaiming, it's a translated quote, "What aspect of freedom can be associated with reclining? The very opposite is true. It makes one look sickly." Prohibited. That's a fair point, I think. The Tur later, so the Tur around the same time, a little earlier and a little later, the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, both respected and still authoritative sources of Jewish law, even to today, ultimately settled the question. Reclining is, of course, something we still practice, and it's considered a special practice for Passover, even though it lacks that cultural context, even though it doesn't mean the same thing that it meant when the custom began in the ancient world. Okay, so another tension point, another time when we see evolution in the custom of reclining. And this has to do with the practice of women reclining at the Seder. So think about the difference in roles, the difference in an experience of a Seder, which I imagine there is a lot of that still true today in some families, that being able to recline during a meal is different depending on your job in putting together the meal for the family. It's true. I already heard, and it's true. So it's still true today. But look, so let's start at the Talmud. According to the Talmud, a woman in front of her husband does not need to recline. But if she is an important woman, if she is an Isha Chashuva, she must do so. Okay, so in general, women in front of their husbands, don't need to recline unless they're important women. The Rashbam, 12th century France, comments that a woman does not need to recline because the fear of her husband is upon her, and she is subject to him. Similarly, the Or Zarua, 13th century Vienna, we're getting a trip around Jewish law and time and space. He only requires widows, divorcees, and single women to recline. So very, very similar. So we're laughing a little bit, and of course we laugh, and it's also serious, both at the same time. So I wonder, when I read these texts, what is behind it? So it's not a more complicated answer than we come from a patriarchal society. That's true. Does it mean that a married woman is not really free enough to recline, to enact this freedom? Is a married woman actually not? It wouldn't be real. Would it be? Whether it would be disrespectful to her husband to do so because she has other obligations at the meal, or do the rabbis, are they reacting against or responding or sensitive to the fact that it's not really authentically their experience of being free in that same way during a Seder, which they may be responsible for preparing and serving? So is it disrespectful? Is it maybe just not true enough to even do it? Really important questions. Another rabbi from 12th century England frames the issue differently. A little bit differently. It's all connected by taking into account a woman's other simultaneous obligations. So this is what he writes. A married woman burdened by the preparation of the meal is exempt from the requirement of reclining. And then we hear again this important woman. But an Isha Chashuva, an important woman who has servants who are burdened by the meal preparation, while she can sit on a proper seat, she must recline. So in other words, two competing obligations. Jewish law understands a lot of our customs and practices as being about obligation. So two competing obligations, and if a woman doesn't have the obligation to prepare and present and serve the meal because she has servants, then she has a different obligation to recline. So this is very there are so many layers here. This is very complicated. So here, reclining in the context of Jewish law and gender roles, is both a symbol of freedom, which you have or you don't have, or you have or you don't have in complicated ways, and it's a religious obligation. So are you free enough to have the obligation upon you to recline? Are you free enough to have to do something? So it's a counterintuitive. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a paradox. One of you will have the best word for this, but are we free enough to be obligated? Are we free enough to be beholden to a higher obligation toward God and toward our tradition? We have another rabbi says, I love this one. I'm just going to include this one because I love this, because it's funny also. Another rabbi says, all of our women in our community are ishot chashuvot. All of our women in our nashim chashuv. Yes. So all of our women in our community are important women. They must recline. There's even a rabbi who says that he would bring a special bed to the table so that his wife would be able to recline. Okay, so yeah. What? Mitah chashuva. So I'm gonna move forward from bringing all these sources. The privilege to recline at a seder was definitely a sign of respect, and though it didn't always include women, it certainly evolved in how it included women. Reclining has always changed in meaning based on cultural context. So what was a clear indication of freedom in the ancient world didn't have the same meaning in later centuries. So we see with this debate over time and all of these different sources, and there are a lot more, I just brought a few, we ultimately preserved the practice. And as we in the tradition of these rabbis, we can continue to read it. We're going to do it. We still are going to do it. That was the conclusion. But what does it mean, and how is it carried out, and what's the cultural context? We can add to that looking forward, and not only on Passover, but all the time. In my experience, this little leaning to the left, so we don't actually sit on couches, but leaning to the left at the Seder can be a way to transport ourselves back to this ancient time and to imagine what it would have been like to have first been slaves and then to be able to act out in a way like flipping the narrative. Having been slaves and then being able to recline when we eat, finally no longer slaves, and finally free, and finally able to have the peace and security that you need in order to recline while eating. But I think that as much as I can try to imagine that, I don't really know what it's like to be in the ancient world and to get to do the thing that means the most in my society, in my cultural context, to signify freedom, because that's not our signifier of freedom today. We do it at the Seder. That's the time of the year that we remember, but it's not the same visceral kind of visceral, emotional, natural way as it was for our ancestors. So I have been thinking, as a way to connect to reclining and as a way to think about freedom all the time, what's the thing for us that's reclining? So reclining is a placeholder, which we do because our tradition obligates us to. But what's that today? So how do we demonstrate freedom? What makes us feel free today? Is it voting? Is it skydiving, swimming in the ocean? I'll share that. And then I think we have some time if a couple of you want to share. I had to renew my passport last month, and there was paperwork, and I had to get pictures taken, and there was some, going to the post office. But what I felt more than anything else was a sense of real privilege and freedom to be able to have this document that would allow me so many rights in the world. And, the ability to travel, the ability to have the obligations and the privileges and the freedom of being a citizen of the United States. And so for me, renewing my passport was like my reclining. What do you think? If you had to pick a motion or an action that would be like reclining today for you, what do you think?
I've never ridden a motorcycle.
Riding a motorcycle.
Which I've never done. Riding a Harley, the wind in your hair, and there it is. Did you have to have longer hair for that?
Riding a motorcycle with the wind in your hair. Voting for your government. Yeah. Yeah. Love that. Free speech. Exercising free speech. We were, the other day, we saw some local protesters in the neighborhood who were protesting the right, anti-choice protesters. And Karen and I were talking about what it means to have the freedom to express your beliefs, even if the people around you might not agree with you, but that you can hold signs and you can, peacefully share your views in this country. Yeah. Anyone else? So that was maybe they're reclining. I don't think they would have used that language, but maybe they're reclining that way. They're leaning. Bill, we planned that. I feel like that was so good. That was perfect. So Bill just said they're reclining to the right. That was the line. Okay. I love that. Anyone else? Yeah, thank you. Welcome. Visiting from Florida.
Hard thing because the judiciary is stacked, the legislature is stacked. Protests mean nothing. Laws, it's coming to the point where the laws are meaning nothing. And so we can only pray that our governor does not ascend to any kind of higher level where the nation will not be able to recover.
Wow, beautiful. So I won't try to paraphrase because you said it so beautifully. We have a visitor from Florida who spoke about what it means to lose rights and lose some feeling like one's losing rights and losing freedom in the way that laws are changing. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I hope that, was there more? Oh, yes. Rabbi.
Follow your own inclination, your own feeling and sense of purpose in life, to be able to follow that up along the way as far as it can take you.
Rabbi Bash shared that maybe reclining for us is to be able to follow one's own purpose and calling and inclination in life, to decide what to do with a life is quite an enactment of freedom and quite a privilege. Thank you. Yeah. Equitable justice. Access to justice. So when we access justice, we keep reclining throughout the year toward freedom. Well, thank you all for thinking about it and sharing it. And I hope that not just for we have more of Passover. This is our celebration of freedom. So we're in Zman Cherutenu, the time of our freedom. So for Passover and also all the time, I hope that we can think about and rethink and question what it means to act out our freedom, both to understand our ancestors, understand how they struggled with how they were going to act out and symbolically play out their freedom, and also to breathe new life into this custom. Maybe for next year, maybe, anytime in the future. So I want to end with one of the first blessings that we say every day is part of our Birkot HaShachar, is part of our morning blessings. We say, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani bat chorin. I would say bat. Someone else might say ben chorin. We bless God for making us a free person, for making us free. So I bless us for being free too, for making us free. I bless God for making us free. And I wish us a Chag Sameach.